Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Joshua chapter 11, where we read of the northern campaign, Joshua's northern campaign against the cities of Canaan. In chapter 6 through 8, we read of what we call the central campaign. That was the fall of Jericho and Ai, and it started off with victory in Jericho. Didn't go so well at first in Ai, but then there was a final victory of that city. And then Gibeon pulled a deception against the Israelites, deceived them into thinking they were very far away, and they entered into a covenant with the Israelites. And that kicked off a southern campaign where Jerusalem led an entire coalition against Gibeon, but really it was going to be against Israel. And in that battle, Joshua commands the sun and the moon to stand still. That was all in chapter 10. Now we come to chapter 11, and we're going to read about the northern campaign. Instead of Jerusalem leading the coalition, this time it will be Hatzor leading this coalition, and Joshua is going to bring about what looks like a surprise attack by the waters of Merom. Joshua chapter 11, verse 1, Then it came about when Jabin, king of, and I know it looks like Hazor, but I'm going to pronounce it the way I learned to in Israel, the king of Hatzor heard of it, that he sent to Jobab, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Ashaphah, and to the kings who were of the north in the hill country, and in the Arabah south of Chinneroth. Chinneroth is another name for Sea of Galilee, and in the lowland and the heights of Dor, and on the west. He goes on, verse 3, to the Canaanite on the east and to the west, and the Amorite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Jebusite in the hill country, and the Hivite at the foot of Hermon in the land of Mizpah. In other words, everybody that was in the area of northern Canaan is going to join up with this coalition. And so here we see it on a map. Notice Hatzor, I know it looks like Hazor, Hatzor is going to be the leading city of this coalition because Hatzor was the major city in northern Canaan. And so this collection of different cities are going to link up with Hatzor, and they're going to get ready to come down and fight Israel. Chapter 11, verse 4, They came out, they and all their armies with them, and as many people as the sand that is on the seashore. That's a lot of people. Sort of reminds me of the promises that had been made about how many Israelites there would be. Well, here's the ones that are against the Israelites, and they're that many. But notice, not just a lot of people, with very many horses and chariots. Now you've just kicked it up to a new level, because horses and chariots were that was like saying the tanks or the nuclear missiles of the ancient world. This was state-of-the-art weaponry, and the Israelites had no horses, had no chariots. Verse 5, So all these kings, having agreed to meet, came and encamped together at the waters of Merom. Now we have a good guess as to where that is. That's in the highlands of what we call Upper Galilee. Galilee is sort of divided into two sections. The north, and it's not upper because it's north, it's upper because it's actually higher. And then southern Galilee, we just call lower Galilee because the hills there aren't quite so high. And probably this is in northern Galilee. So all these kings, they agreed to meet, they came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. Verse 6, Then the Lord said to Joshua, Do not be afraid because of them. After all, Joshua has, from a humanly speaking, he's got a reason to be afraid. He's going to face a very highly developed, a very technological army that has horses and chariots and the most advanced weaponry of that day. And God says, Don't be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will deliver all of them, slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. Is that merely predictive, or is this a command, or maybe a little bit of both? We'll see. Verse 7, So Joshua and all the people of war with him came upon them suddenly. Now we're not told how he got there suddenly. After all, his camp had been way down at a place called Gilgal near Jericho, and so for them to come all the way up to the waters of Merom, was this a forced march? God had said it's going to happen tomorrow. Was he already on his way? We're not told details, so I don't want to jump to a conclusion, but it sounds like a forced march and a surprise attack. And this is emphasized here when Joshua and the people of war came upon them suddenly. Verse 8, The Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel. so that they defeated them and pursued them as far as Great Sidon. Now Sidon, that's a Phoenician city. That's all the way outside of Canaan. And Misrephoth-maim. Interesting name there. You can sort of see a little bit. Remember how you have these creatures called the seraph, and I know that the seraphoth, that part. A seraph is we think of it as an angel. It actually means a burning one. And Misrephoth is the burning, and then Maim is the word for waters. The burning of the waters. I just think that's an interesting name, sort of tantalizing. Makes me wonder, what was going on there. And I don't know. But he pursues them this far, and the valley of Mizpah to the east, and they struck them until no survivor was left to them. Verse 9, Joshua did to them as the Lord had told him. You see, this was not just prophetic, this was by way of command. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. Now that's interesting, because Joshua has just captured this great military machine. What do you do when you've captured all this weaponry? Well, do you put it to use? No. Psalm chapter 20, verse 7 talks about how some boast in chariots and some boast in horses, but we will boast in the name of the Lord our God. You see, Israel was not to depend upon this high degree of technology, and that's not to say they never used technology, but at this point in their history, they're supposed to trust in the Lord. And so the horses are actually rendered unfit for battle. They're not killed, but they're not going to be of any use pulling chariots really fast on a battlefield. Verse 10, then Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hatzor, and struck its king with the sword, for Hatzor formerly was the head of all these kingdoms. Hatzor was a really important city. In fact, we've done archaeological digs at Hatzor, and we know that it was it went through various destructions. It was had been a city for a long time before this, and would again be rebuilt. And we're going to see Hatzor later on too. We'll look at that just a moment. Verse 11: they struck every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was no one left who breathed. That's sort of all-inclusive. And he burned Hatzor with fire. And indeed, if we look to the period of around 1400 BC, that's around the time of Joshua, sure enough, we see a destruction level there for the burning of Hatzor. You can go and you can see the tell. You can always tell the tell because it's sort of a hill where it's been built up and then higher and higher. And this was quite a large city, the city of Hatzor, that went through a destruction at this time. Well, Hatzor, it's referenced in the Amarna tablets, that those tablets that were found in Egypt that date to around this time in history. And so it's referenced there in the Amarna tablets. They were and had been, prior to this, a vassal to Egypt. Of course, that's going to undergo a change with its destruction. But we're going to see it become a city again. And again, we're going to see it become not just a city, but a Canaanite city. So even though it goes through this destruction, there will be a rebuilding, and it will be a Canaanite rebuilding. So that it was destroyed here by Joshua, but it's again going to be subdued by Deborah and Barak. That's going to be in Judges chapter 4. We'll see that take place. And then we'll see that it's inhabited again in the days of Solomon. 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 15. Reference it. By this time it will be a Jewish city. So it goes through a number of incarnations. Now Joshua chapter 11, verse 13. However, Israel did not burn any cities that stood on their mounds, except Hatzor alone, which Joshua burned. Now, notice that's quite an interesting statement. Even though the Israelites are capturing different places, they're not burning the cities. And so archaeologists have noted, wait a minute, Joshua talks about the capture of all these cities, and we can go there and we can say, yes, Hatzor was burned around this time, but not all these other cities. And for that reason, there have been archaeologists who said, well, this must not be the time of Israel's conquest. In fact, some archaeologists have gone so far to say, well, Israel never did conquer. Well, we're told that they didn't burn the cities. And so we shouldn't expect it to look like, something vastly different. After all, the house in which I lived before I lived in it, somebody else lived in it. The house wasn't burned down and then I moved in. And so if you did an archaeological dig of my house, you might not find a lot of evidence that showed somebody else had lived there prior to me. And similar in this situation here. Chapter 11, verse 18, Joshua waged war a long time with all these kings. Now, we're not told the time frame here. We're just told it was a long time. And there was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel except the Hivites living in Gibeon. We already read about that. But all the rest, they took them all in battle. Verse 24, it was of the Lord to harden their hearts. The reason it was not except for Gibeon, and of course remember Rahab and her family back in Jericho, but for the rest of them, the reason they didn't make peace, it was because it was of the Lord to harden their hearts, to meet Israel in battle, in order that he might utterly destroy them, that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Yes, the Israelites were under an injunction, but notice God put it in their hearts not to say, hey, we give up, we're going to throw ourselves on the mercy of the court. That didn't happen. And so the Israelites never had to question, well, gee, what do we do if they give up? If they say, hey, we just want to become Israel. That didn't happen. It didn't happen because God had hardened their hearts. It reminds me a little bit of the way God hardened the heart of Pharaoh back in Egypt. Now, let me just also say, it wasn't the Israelites or the Canaanites who were saying, gee, we really want to surrender, but we can't because God is hardening our hearts. No, I'm sure they were participants in the process. But what we read here was that the Lord hardened their hearts. And we don't want to soften that. So we have the central campaign, chapters 6 through 8, the southern campaign, chapters 9 through 10. Here in chapter 11, we have the northern campaign. And finally, a summary statement in verse 16 that not a city made peace and the Lord hardened their heart. Now we get to verse 21, and we read that Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim. Well, we haven't really talked too much about them. The Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Notice it's called the hill country of Judah and Israel. Well, that points to the idea that this is likely stated, this is likely written, at a time when there would be a distinction between Judah and Israel. That's not going to happen until after the death of Solomon. And so this is a hint that at least this verse, if not the entire book, comes to its final form in the days of the kings. But now we read that Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. There were no Anakim left. Who are these Anakim? Well, the Anakim had been referenced. Remember when Moses had sent the 12 spies into the land of Canaan. And 10 of them had come back and said, we saw the Anakim there. They are really big guys. Now, that doesn't mean they were 20 feet tall, but they might have been a bit taller than the Israelites. The average height at certain times, for example, the Romans, the average height for a Roman was around 5'4". Now we're not talking Romans here. I don't know how big the Israelites were, but apparently there were other people that were bigger than them. For example, I'm 6 foot, and I remember when I was growing up, there were a lot of people that were just sort of shorter. 6 foot was sort of tall. Nowadays, it seems like, maybe I'm wrong, it seems like that's sort of average. And the Anakim, they were tall. And notice verse 22. When Joshua was done with them, there were no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel. Only in these places, in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod, some remained. And of course, that's where we're going to see a really big guy by the name of Goliath much later on. Verse 23, so Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. Now, we just said there's some left along the coastline. But overall, the land is captured. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their division by their tribes, and thus the land had rest from war. And it's that rest that I want to look at right now. The land had rest from war. That idea of rest, Joshua chapter 21, verse 44, we're going to read when we get there, the Lord gave them rest on every side. And then chapter 22, verse 4, now the Lord your God has given rest to your brothers, Joshua's going to say. And then chapter 23, verse 1, and the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies on every side. This idea where God's going to bring them into the land. Yes, they do the fighting. Yes, they do the struggle. But then there will be a time of rest. Now, Hebrews chapter 4 comments on this. So it's a New Testament commentary on that Old Testament idea of rest. And the writer to the Hebrews says, for if Joshua had given them rest, that is, lasting rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that. And the point is made that in the Psalms it talks about the rest that God's people into which they must enter. A rest that's beyond that which Joshua had promised. And so the writer to the Hebrews concludes, so there remains a Sabbath rest, not just the fact that you have the Sabbath day, everybody knew that, but what it represents, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Hebrews 4:10, for the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works as God did from his. There's a rest into which we can enter that goes beyond the rest that Joshua provided. In fact, the rest that Joshua provided is merely a picture of the much deeper rest into which we can enter. Verse 11, therefore let us be diligent to enter that rest, so that no one will fall through following the same example of disobedience. There were some who had disobeyed back in the wilderness. They didn't enter into the promised land. They did not enter into Joshua's rest. And likewise, we fail to enter into a rest when we don't follow, when we don't trust in the other Joshua. You say the other Joshua? Yes. Actually, we usually pronounce it either Yeshua, another way of saying Joshua, or sometimes we pronounce it in English at least, Jesus, who has provided a better rest, which makes him a better Joshua.